सैयद हुसैन नसर की किताब Knowledge and Sacred was the Gifford Lectures. So Gifford Lectures are the most prestigious, generally because they're the most prestigious lectures in theology given in the Western Academy. So as far as I know, I don't know if any other Muslim has given them. I think he was the first and only Muslim. He was definitely the first one. If there's another one, that would be after after that time period. But the Knowledge is Sacred are the Gifford Lectures, and I think the whole point Professor Nasser was trying to make with that was to give an alternative, alternative vision of what is knowledge and what has really happened in what we are calling modernity, right? In the modern period, in the last few hundred years, particularly in the Western world and through its influence in the rest of the world. But looking at things not from a Eurocentric or Western-centric perspective, which is really has become the norm. I think a couple of people brought that out as well. That look at things not only from an Islamic point of view, but just a non-Western point of view, which of course he comes himself from an Islamic point of view. But in this book, he's also looking at a broader range of sources for what he would call the traditional perspective, right? So including other religious traditions. So West's own intellectual and religious heritage in Christianity, but also Chinese traditions, Hinduism, and native and shamanic traditions, and so on. To contrast, of course, they're different from each other, but from one point of view, they can all be contrasted in certain ways with the modern Western point of view. That's can be called distinctly modern, or at least in this definition of modern. That started in the last few 100 years, and that involved particular developments that were truly novel or were different from what happened before. So while on one hand you can think of that human beings go through a period of change where there's innovations happening in every era, and there's also, of course, sources of change, but there's also sources of stability as well, right? So there's things which are continuous and things which are discontinuous in societies. But Nasser's argument, and also the argument of some people who are really very different perspective, as we'll see, someone like Neil Postman or someone like that, that modernity, while that could be a way of defining modernity, modernity should really be seen as something quite specific, that there's aspects of it, aspects of something that happened in the Western world in the last 400 or 500 years, really starting with the Renaissance, and then with developments such as the scientific revolution, which gives birth to the Industrial Revolution, which ushers in the age, what's sometimes called the Age of Enlightenment, although Dr. Nasser has sometimes mentioned it's called the Endarkenment, because from his perspective, it's a period of the loss of wisdom, or the reduction of wisdom to just rationality, rationality, and so a kind of impoverishment of the intellect. And that's a key point that he mentioned in his book as well. But so, and then of course, enlightenment then gives rise to various kinds of has been a kind of key perspective that has influenced thought in the modern world ever since. So modernity, from this perspective, is a not only a historical phase, but it's whatever the most up-to-date thing is, but rather a very specific vision, a very specific perspective that can only come to be understood when it's contrasted with something other than it. Usually, what has ended up happening in the last few hundred years, is that the modern Western perspective has been so much taken as the norm that it has been hard to argue outside of it, even see it outside of it. It has set the terms for the discourse. It has set the terms for how do we think about what the world is about, who are human beings, what are we supposed to do with ourselves, politically, ethically, socially, what is the goal of life? All of these really kind of big questions have been framed in terms that have been derived more and more from Western processes of modernization, right? So what Dr. Nasser is trying to do here in this book generally is to call that call that out. First of all, to trace how a particular and using a particular Western perspective develops, and he uses knowledge as the basis for that. One can he could have taken some other way as well, but he makes knowledge the central way of looking at how knowledge has become transformed, because knowledge, of course, is key to the transformation itself, right? So perhaps it is the most viable or one of the most useful ways of looking at what has changed. One can, as I said, one can look at how economy has changed, how politically things have changed, what kind of social, ethical changes have there been. But a lot of what undergirds these changes, one could argue at least, is a intellectual change that comes with a different understanding of what knowledge is and how knowledge is acquired, and also what can even be known. In this perspective, these are parts of in just a few words, I'll just summarize. You were the whole chapter was very long, so we didn't want to burden you too much. So it just had you read 10, 12 pages, I think, which is only about a third or half to a third of that chapter of knowledge and the sacred. But so I'll just say a few words about how he starts off with that chapter, what his main argument seems to be, before getting to what the part that you read, which traces very specific changes that occur in modern thought, right? So his larger argument is that knowledge has become separated from being, right? So that ontology and epistemology, although one could argue that there were always two different subfields of at least traditional philosophy, but they were always went hand in hand. So knowing and being were not two totally different things. That knowledge was very much related to, in a certain sense, to experience, one could say, in a broader sense. So if the knowledge was not something which was purely something in the head, in the mind, in just through, and that was just acquired through rational means, through reason alone, right? That knowledge came from something more than reason. So there's other sources of knowledge than reason, and reason itself has, in this modern period, become impoverished by being disconnected from a broader understanding of intelligence. The intelligence is not about just debating, arguing. One could argue for anything. One could technically, rationally, one could really use, unless it was just purely illogical or something, but one could make all sorts of arguments that really are not based, one doesn't have to base it on the truth. I mean, lots of people who lie or who are selling particular perspectives use rational means to convince people. Like we've seen this politicians. If you listen to, in fact, some of the worst kind of people over the last 100 years, they use rational argumentation. Hitler used rationality in many ways to make his arguments. He didn't just bring up a gun and say, I'm going to shoot you if you don't believe this. Maybe sometimes, but as well as other, I'm just giving him as an extreme example, but rationality can be used in all sorts of ways. It's Nasser argues that intelligence, in line with traditional modes of understanding what knowledge was about, and just looking at the Islamic tradition, aql is not just modern rational. It's not modern reason. It's not cunning or deliberation or cleverness or the kinds of things that we associate with reasoning, or some of the things. It's the aql in the Arabic usage of the term, as it's used both, particularly by Islamic philosophers, and has to do with and the way, for example, other words are used in the Quran, like tafakkur, fikr, and the Quran talks about the ulul albab, those that have wisdom and understanding, and so on. That the intelligence had a deeper function of knowing things as they are. So it had the possibility of actually kind of direct grasping of truths. And in the modern context, some people say, well, what is that? So an example that can be easily given is that of mathematics, right? So mathematics is like 2 + 2 4. You either get it or you don't. It's not, some can explain it through in a rational way to you, but that is given, for example, that mathematical truths are one example of a using intelligence in a broader sense of going, that there's something in there's a way of that not everything can be known purely through reason, that there's a kind of intuitive or direct way of grasping the truth, grasping of acquiring knowledge that's not just based on rationality. But in the Latin Christian tradition, you had the difference between ratio, ratio, and intellectus, right? So ratio was this process of just kind of thinking through something, while intellectus was something more contemplative. It was a way of coming to know something in a deeper way and with more certitude. So what Nasser is talking about is that the difference with modern understandings, which come from a particular intellectual trajectory, result in a impoverished understanding of what the intellect is capable of. And once that happens, a particular kind of vision of the universe is lost, and of the human being, right? So if you reduce the human being to just being able to use one's rationality, you eventually come to cut human beings off from knowing anything other than that which you can just know purely rationally. So in many ways, with some of the things that people mentioned here, something, for example, like the growth of materialism. It's not just that people got greedy or something. It's based on the whole idea that the material is that which can be known. From there, you slowly make a world in which the material alone is important, because it's the only thing that you can truly kind of know, or you can have a sense of, right? Although from a traditional kind of point of view, Nasser, not in your reading, but in another place, it's argued that matter is actually the thing that is least knowable. And in fact, the intellect cannot look at what the essence of matter is, but it can actually grasp the essence of things which are more abstract. But we're not going to go like, God or something, but we're not going to go in that direction, at least right now, because it'll take us in a different conversation. But so that basically that is Dr. Nasser's larger argument, that due to knowledge coming to be defined in a particular way, the intellect is reduced to reason and then to cunning and cleverness. And this is accompanied, therefore, by a loss of the sense of the sacred, because the intellect cannot function, the intelligence cannot function in a way which recognizes anything beyond the empirical or material world. It gets harder and harder to take anything as real, which is not material, which, for example, cannot be rationally investigated. And of course, that goes in hand with the rise of modern science, which itself, the scientific method, reduces it, or if it's taken as the criteria for all knowledge, instead of just as a way of understanding physical reality and studying physical reality, then it ends up becoming a way in which anything beyond physical reality can be denied, right? So if we can understand things only through our senses, or only through observation, only through empirical means, then all that which we cannot observe or we cannot know through our senses slowly becomes more and more unreal, right? That becomes things like anything which is transcendent, right? So God, the angels, prophets, even eventually a kind of a higher morality or something, or what it's based on, unless you're just talking about whatever morality is, social convention, or is utilitarianism or something like that. So this process begins for Dr. Nasser with really a process of so the loss of an intellectual vision of things, which you could even call a kind of a loss of wisdom, or looking at things from a perspective in which knowledge is not just purely reason, or it is not acquired purely through sensory or rational means, but through a broader or greater vision of some kind of direct knowledge of truth. This process begins in ancient Greece. That ancient Greece is really the kind of the first civilization, at least in known history, in which there are certain forms of desacralization. What he calls desacralization are basically a perspective in which the sacred is marginalized, or is no longer central. That begins with the ancient Greeks. Plato, for example, already decries the loss of a symbolist spirit, the loss of understanding of symbolism. Olympian religion, if you know something about the religion of the Greeks, it's quite superficial with the gods and their jealousies. It's as if it's like a human soap opera projected onto the heavenly realms or something like that, and which you didn't have really in any other civilization that we know of. Other things, for example, the rise of rationalism, that reason alone can know things. For example, Plato again criticizes that a kind of even a humanism. Protagoras, one of the characters in one of the works of Plato, says man is the measure of all things. Again, this kind of idea that the human it defines his own own identity and own reality uh, without any other transcendent orders or for example, the Pyrrho who began skepticism, or Epicurus, who's kind of the founder of many ways of even a kind of a materialism. And these were philosophers, interesting, that Muslims didn't actually pick up. The more skeptical and materialist philosophers, but that dimension was there in ancient Greece. When Christianity comes in to the Western world, it therefore already is rebelling or defines itself as a way of love against these kinds of currents, who, from a Christian point of view, have taken rationality or human reason, intelligence, in directions that are incompatible with a spiritual perspective, right? So if the reason is being used to say that we can't know anything, like the skeptics were doing, or Epicurus is arguing that the pursuit of, or rationally really arguing that, everything is transient, therefore drawing conclusions the opposite of which a religious tradition would do, saying since everything is transient anyways, all we can do is eat, drink, and be merry, and just pleasure ourselves as much as possible. And so these kinds of ideas and many others led to Christianity developing in a direction in which its understanding of what Nasser uses this term that you might have come across, sapiential. Does anybody know what that means? Sapiens or sapiential? Sapience has to do with wisdom, with a perspective that's based on an understanding of reality in which knowledge and being are go hand in hand. So in Arabic, something like ma'rifah, for example, or marfat, would denote a sapiential perspective, right? What the Sufis are talking about, what Islamic philosophers are talking about, that reality can truly be known or grasped. So if you read Al-Ghazali's autobiography, 𝗗𝗲𝘀𝗰𝗿𝗶𝗏, he basically goes through different perspectives. He looks at theologians, the mutakallimun, realizes they're just basically arguing from dogma, from already holding certain positions. He looks at, of course, jurists and so forth. And again, their knowledge is based on authority, on just kind of following what certain authoritative sources. And that might be valid in this particular point of view. But for Al-Ghazali, it does not, he says it doesn't do enough for him. So then he moves to philosophy, where he realizes this is all coming from kind of a rational perspective. And all of these things he becomes disillusioned with until he discovers what he says is dhawq, is experiential knowledge, taste really in Arabic. So experiential knowledge that comes from experience, a knowledge that combines knowledge and being. Because the reason I'm using this is maybe it's a bit abstract for some people. What do I mean? Or knowledge that's combined with being, or something like that. So Al-Ghazali, it's for example, an apple, from a rational point of view, you don't need to have ever eaten an apple to give us a whole kind of analysis of apple. You might not have even seen an apple. Somebody else might describe an apple to you, and you might describe it. That would be kind of knowledge, maybe through authority, right? So you don't know what an apple is, but somebody tells you, okay, an apple involves this, it's this fruit, which you've never seen one. You live in a part of the world there's no apple, but the person you get the description from, you trust them. They're authoritative. They generally tell the truth. That's a form of knowledge through authority. Sometimes, for example, our knowledge of Quran or Hadith, we can't come up with Hadith ourselves or the Quran ourselves, right? It's always based on authority. But so is grammar, so is history, right? We don't know if Alexander the Great ever existed. We only know it because, historians have told us and we trust those historians. So it is a form of knowledge, but it's a form of knowledge that comes from the outside. You can never kind of come up with it yourself. So Al-Ghazali is not particularly interested in that, or he said, all right, it's good, we need it, but there needs to be something else, right? So apple, then somebody can bring you an apple. You might see it, you might dissect it, you might relate it to other fruits, you might classify as this kind of fruit, not that kind of fruit. It's appears this way, it feels this way, it has these characteristics, grows at this time. That would be kind of an empirical and rational form of knowledge in both of those, right? So something you're kind of investigating, but it's still something outside of you, right? You're using your reason to understand a kind of phenomena that is not a part of you, right? It's an object. And you are determining what it is and so on. But the highest level of knowledge, in just using Al-Ghazali's scheme that actually solved his own kind of intellectual and spiritual crisis, which is he was looking for yaqeen or certainty, was that the apple is tasting the apple. So when you taste the apple, what happens? How is it different from the other forms of knowledge?
That would be experiential knowledge, as you just mentioned, and of course, then you can also give it meaning, but that would become more subjective to some extent as well. Like you would have a subjective aspect to that as well.
All right. Yes. So absolutely, experiential knowledge, right? So experiential knowledge is about eating the apple, and so what happens when you eat the apple? You become, in one sense, you really become one with the object of knowledge. So it's not really even just purely subjective. It's when the object and subject come together. Maybe you then thinking about it or explaining it in a particular way might become subjective. But in that moment of you actually consuming the apple, as just an allegory, you and the apple become one. It's a process of being and knowledge come together in experience. It's not just something in your head. It's like, again, another example would be love, right? So you can read all sorts of odes about love. You can read, an irrational kind of treatment of what love is, and hear people talk about it and so on. But experiencing love is a kind of knowledge, right? Your knowledge you have of love, but it's a higher form of knowledge. It's not just something. If one only talked about love from a rational point of view, that would be a great impoverishment of what love is about. If humanity just stopped understanding love through experience, but only kind of talked about it in a rational way. So so Dr. Nasser's point of view is that's what we've done really with the whole, at least particularly in the Western world, with the rise of modern philosophy, and which moves away from this kind of understanding of sapience or of a knowledge which is based in being, which is united with experiencing being, but rather it's based on just kind of thinking alone. And this begins with, if you're going to learn any Latin, if in this course, this is what you should know, cogito ergo sum, right? So cogito ergo sum. Does anybody know what this means? So this is from Descartes. Descartes is the founder of modern philosophy. So Descartes, if anybody's wants dates, I'd like, because he lived from 596 to 1650. He's the founder of modern philosophy. So philosophy takes a major turn with Descartes. There's reasons of why Descartes doesn't come out of a vacuum. So nominalism, which I don't think we have time to really deeply go into what that is, but in the late medieval period, Christian period, nominalism arises, which, tracing back to what we were talking about, the ancient Greek heritage comes back into medieval Europe. And in many positive ways, Muslims reintroduced Europeans to Plato, Aristotle, and so forth. But in distinction to the Islamic world, certain currents began in the Western world, which move knowledge away from what can be called the sacred, right? That desacralized knowledge, beginning with nominalism, with people like William of Ockham and so forth, who argue that basically things cannot be fully known by the human intellect, that what we are saying that is the perception of things are just names that we're giving to these things. So all we can know is names. We don't know if it's really like there's anything behind it. So therefore, since these folks are still Christian, they're like, what we can know is really through the Bible and through kind of other kind of sacred sources. But there's no good reason to hold on to these sources. So that's the next kind of movement. If you've already made the argument that the human intellect cannot know, you just have to just take it on authority. More or less, that's what the nominalists are arguing. Or even if that's not their direct argument, that's the direction in which the argument leads. Other people will come and say, all right, then, this is I don't want to just take things on authority. Let's find a new basis for knowledge. And that's what Descartes tries to do. In his meditations, which is his main work, he sits around and starts thinking, how do I know anything? So in a certain sense, he's doing the same thing as Al-Ghazali, but he ends up going in a very different direction with it. And through all sorts of ideas, for example, he says, how do I know anything? Maybe all of my realities is the imagination of a demon. It's a very interesting kind of strange thought experiments. But eventually he comes to this idea, cogito ergo sum. And modern thought and modern philosophy, it can really be defined or really begins here. And literally, I would argue that all philosophy after Descartes, unless there were people actively trying to go against Descartes, is influenced by this idea, which means, does anybody know what this means? No one. Yeah, I said you did not. But okay, so yeah, it's I think, therefore I am. Right. So Descartes' idea that I think, therefore I am. What this does is it turns the relationship between epistemology and ontology upside down. Right. So previously you would begin with the idea that there's existence. So if you've studied some Islamic philosophy in this class, oftentimes it starts with, in this course, with wajud, with existence, right? So the idea that things are is a kind of a given. It's the most basic perception. What Descartes does is that he moves things from existence to the mind, to thought or thinking. So from then on, human beings are seen as as primarily that any way that they can know anything is through thinking. And of course, Descartes through thinking doesn't mean this kind of unitive vision. He doesn't mean experiential knowledge. He really means rationality. That's what he's doing in his work. So thinking, thought, rationality becomes the criteria for all knowledge. And even for being. He doesn't even know if he exists if he doesn't have a mind that's telling him, yeah, you exist. So it's a very specific, way of thinking about knowledge. So, which places the individual consciousness of the thinking subject as the only source for knowledge and certitude. This can be largely called the epistemological turn. Right? So epistemological turn in philosophy, which only occurs in the West, right? So all other forms of philosophy, Islamic philosophy, but if you went to Hindu philosophy, Buddhist philosophy, Chinese philosophy, of course have some epistemological theory. Epistemology has to do with, if you don't know that term, knowing things. It's theory of knowledge. It's just it's a philosophical way of talking about theory of knowledge. So everyone has a theory of knowledge, but basing all of reality on epistemology is a new thing that really begins with Descartes. So everything that can be known from now on is whatever the human mind can immediately kind of perceive. So in this sense, or the individual human mind, right? So the thinking of the individual human mind, remember, individual human mind is really tied to the ego. So it's the individual human kind of self becomes the criterion for all knowledge. And therefore, this is like the first step in the banishing of a metaphysical view of the world, right? Because instead, if all knowledge is derived only from the mind, then only which the mind can definitely prove can be known to be true. So Descartes believed in God, for example, but he had to come through knowing God through kind of just, it doesn't really follow from his theory. But being a Christian, everybody believed in God at that time, and he talks about God. He doesn't. And how do we then know God? So he has this idea of the pituitary gland and this kind of thing. But very soon after Descartes, based on his theory, philosophers argued, why do we need God at all? Or why do we need anything? How do we know there's anything beyond just what the mind can perceive and the senses can observe? So we get to people like Hume, David Hume, who's another important philosopher, who argues that we can't know anything. Anything, at least surely. It's just, it's what we have. We can make conjectures about things that may or may not be true. We can say, okay, this is probably the best we can understand about a particular topic. But we can't truly know things. This is taken, so Kant does not like this, but at the same time, he subscribes both to Descartes' view. So Kant is probably the most important Western philosopher in the last few centuries, Immanuel Kant. He's a little bit, about 100 years after, if you want to know the date, it's 1724 to 1804. So about 100 years after the lifetime of, a little bit more than 100 years, is kind of after Descartes. He's born 120 years after Descartes. So he argues that complete skepticism would be very problematic, because then why are we saying anything? But what his basic argument, in which he's referencing both the Cartesian point of view and the rise of modern science, in which a empirical observation, knowing things through the senses, through our five senses, becomes really the only form of knowledge, right? And some of the Greek philosophers, even Aristotle himself, although he was more than this, he kind of laid the grounds for this, and then his view was adopted by St. Thomas Aquinas, and then on it went into Western philosophy, and with the rise of modern science became the definitive perspective on along with the rationality on acquiring knowledge through the senses, to reason. So what Kant says is we cannot truly know the noumenal, because the noumenal, some abstract things that are not based on our sensory observations, we cannot really know them. They may exist or they may not. We can't really know them. All we can know is phenomena. So this idea is phenomenal or noumenal. Phenomenal. Yes.
Is thought the ancestry of this thought goes back to Aristotle, essence and substance, because that they have been introduced to. Just to.
Oh, all right. Of the essence of phenomenal and noumenal, or yeah. Yes. All right. Yes. So that basically, from that perspective, you can only know. You can't know the essence, right? You can only know the substance. You can only know the forms. You can only know that which you can observe. So with Kant, it basically what Kant is saying is that you cannot know any metaphysical truths. you can't know anything about God, about anything other than your own kind of physical experience of the world on a physical level, and whatever your mind can do with that. So you can use rationality as well. And he does acknowledge certain things, like what he calls a priori knowledge, but that itself one gets in an indirect way from the categories of the mind that are produced through the kind of one's physical experience in the world. So something like mathematical knowledge would be a priori knowledge for Kant, but even that is a result of empirical knowledge, right? So I'm just very summarizing the kind of key points in these in these philosophers. Of course, one can go deeper into them. But Kant, therefore, is arguing, and he's making a general statement. He's not saying that, I don't know phenomenal, the noumenal. He says no one can know it because it's just not knowable. Because our only source of knowledge is through the senses, right? There's only physical form. So, of course, this form of philosophy, and then it further, goes into, all sorts of philosophers. We can go over all of them, but a couple of that Dr. Nasser mentioned is that at least Descartes and Kant observed or maintained that there's such a thing as logic, or that we can know something through logical, just this, Aristotelian syllogisms, or just basically that there was something immutable about logic, and that reason could know some things, right? Even though that is already a step down from a deeper kind of experiential knowledge or intellect that is tied with being. With the 19th century, people like Hegel and Marx go a step further. Because so this could even be called the historical turn or something. So epistemology itself is made secondary in a certain sense to historicity. So what Hegel, for example, says is that reality is a temporal process. So all you can know about it is the way that history is moving. It's constantly changing. All you can know is really change. And you can make certain kinds of patterns or determinations about change using some form of reason or something, but nothing is immutable. It's so, with Hegel, he's a very complicated thinker. Some people take him in a kind of a spiritual way even, but there's some phrases that some people might have heard. You might have heard the word zeitgeist. Zeitgeist. You say that is zeitgeist of our times. It means kind of the spirit of our times, right? This word is, it's a nice word, but that's coined by Hegel to talk about that all is constant change, that nature, history, society, every individual life is in a state of change, even God himself, right? So Hegel says that God himself, and this of course is very criticized very strongly by Christians for that at his time, that God himself is in the process of becoming, that through that God is the world spirit in a certain sense, that gains by kind of living through every epoch. It's a kind of strange notion for our normal understanding of God, but he even brings God into, so history is really everything. And Marx, of course, applies this to the political realm, to the idea that history is what's important. So a very famous line of Marx, in which I'm going to quote him, the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is, however, to change it. So he takes this idea that history is all that is truly truthful, and he takes philosophy in a direction. The philosophy is not about changing things. You can't really know things, but you can witness for Marx. All you can know is there's, for example, oppressors and oppressed. There's the proletariat, and there are the workers, for example, and there's the owners of the means of production, and the laborers. And they're in a kind of a antagonism, constant antagonism throughout history. And all we can do, yeah, we can study that, but what's that good will that do? We have to actually turn that into action. So a lot of postmodernism is influenced by Marx with this dimension. And Marxists sometimes say, everything is relative. Not Marxists, postmodernists, philosophers, that all is relative, everything can be called into question, it's all up in the air, like Derrida, in Foucault, in very different, those two are very different, and find Foucault a lot more interesting, but nonetheless, they're saying is, but at the same time, these guys are activists. They want to, someone like Foucault actually supported the Islamic Revolution in Iran. Why was he doing that? That's a strange kind of thing. So it was because he, or human rights, all sorts of things, because of this Marxist focus on that the ultimate goal is to change things. Because since we can't really know things well, let's do things instead, right? So at least that's one way of looking at it. Since we've already talked about, so I want to wrap this up for today, but just a couple of more points. So all of this then leads to a kind of a relativism, right? That our knowledge is can always be called into question. And with the triumph of Kant and Hegel's perspective in different ways, Kant argues that objective truth can't be known, all we can know is physical realities and so forth. And people like Hegel and Marx say either that we can't even know those or that they're not important. We get to a place where all knowledge is called into question, and what can be broadly called, the postmodern place, and some people here have talked about, I think brought up relativism. This form of, there's a lot more that I can say about that, but within one important point that Dr. Nasser makes is that thinkers who are not happy about this, who want to posit that there's something more, particularly those, for example, motivated by Christianity or with a larger vision of the world, but do not any longer have any means of intellectually building foundations for a religious worldview. It's like completely, gone. So what do? So people like Kierkegaard, Soren Kierkegaard, one of the most interesting modern writers, I think. He's a Danish philosopher and Christian philosopher, who and Karl Barth, the German Protestant theologians, although they have different perspectives, but just for the sake of argument, I'm putting them together, say that since reason cannot tell us anything, we have to turn to faith. So then a certain form of religiosity comes into play, where faith becomes opposed to reason, which, various modernists have been talking about anyways, but religious people themselves are then accepting this, right? That with Kierkegaard and Barth talking about that the only foundations we can have for religion is faith, and a kind of almost blind faith or conviction, which is not necessarily based on the intelligence in any kind of way, right? So a way of saying, okay, I really believe this is true. And because, it makes sense to me, which is fine, it's all right. But it does divorce religion from the intellect, from intelligence. And from Islamic point of view, this, where the Quran is talking about using your intellect in order to get to religion, this is something that is a move in which you're really ending up banishing, you're accepting what science and reason are saying, or rather what the scientific and rationalist perspectives are saying, right? That and saying, all right, they can have the dunya or they can have the world. We'll just have religion in the afterlife, or something like that. Of course, I think that although many Muslims make this kind of assumption in the modern world, or this move is really a part of certain kind of fundamentalist approaches to, not only fundamentalists, certain kind of approaches to Islam as well. Although with the people might not be knowing this is what they're doing. So we can't really, we've lost the war on the terms of public realm of defining knowledge. So we're just going to say we're just going to rely this on faith or on just authority or something like that. All right. We're like, I think, well past time, so we can pick up some of these things next time. But I do want to see if anyone has questions. And I think there is a question here from Zain Sahaba. How does that? Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good question, right? So this is what I'm saying, that there is that knowledge, that there is a movement particularly in modern philosophy. Modern philosophy generally rejects the idea of a universality of knowledge. You cannot really know universals. You're going to ultimately, although, maybe through logic or through reason, certain kinds, depending on which philosopher we're talking about, but you can ultimately maybe only know particulars, and some form of knowledge can be gathered from that, but not through universals. So automatically, I think things like spiritual experience would be considered as purely personal. Would not be. That's why, from a kind of this modern philosophical point of view, what prophets are saying, what saints, what sages have said, it's just their personal opinions, or they thought they were seeing this or that. It's just their subjective view, and it's dismissed that way all the time. Everybody has their subjective view. So why should we take the subjective view of Abraham or the Prophet Muhammad or Confucius or Plato or whoever it might be? That I have my own subjective opinion, I'll give mine too. So that might be better than theirs. That's the kind of because knowledge is not based on, if there's no criteria for saying why these people are saying what they're for respecting what they're saying as truth, then it just becomes a kind of subjective. At best, one could say, "Oh, what a nice subjective view," right? That'd be nice. It's something edifying, and it's maybe a good thing, but it's still purely subjective. It's just there's no way for you or me to aspire to that. Yeah, I don't know if that answers आपका सवाल, Zareem, but for addresses.
जो आखिरी सवाल है उसके बारे में भी कुछ फरमाएं. Hallucinations. I mean that's an interesting one, right? Is the mind playing tricks on you? Yeah, it's real. How do we?
Okay, yeah.
यानी कि ये रिलीजियस एक्सपीरियंस में कुछ लोग आजकल इसको डिस्कस कर रहे हैं कि the difference between a real visionary experience and an hallucination.
Oh, I see. Okay.
There are external criteria according to which you can give an empirical sort of support कि भाई ये hallucination नहीं था, वाकई सही था, विजन था. मगर आजकल जो ट्रेंड है वो तो यही है कि सब्जेक्टिव था. इस तरह फिलोसॉफिकल पोजीशन ऐसी है कि एम्पिरिकली तो प्रूव हो सकता है कि भाई सही था. अगर किसी ने पहले बता दिया कि ये चीज होगी या उस टाइम ये हो रहा है वहां पे, तो वो
इस तरह मैं एक मिसाल देता हूँ कि मनोयज्ञा में अगर आपने पढ़ी हो तो मौलाना जो फतेहपुरी ने सारी अपनी एक थीसिस बनाया. एंड जो उन्होंने किया वो बड़ा शॉकिंग सा था कि ये जो मतलब उन्होंने ये अखज़ किया कि ये जो हजूर सल्लल्लाहु अलैहि वसल्लम पे जो कैफियत आई हैं वो एक जहन की इख्तरा है. तो ये मतलब बॉटम लाइन वहां से उन्होंने उसकी बनाई और जो हेलुसिनेशन से उसको टाई किया. तो मैं सपोर्ट नहीं कर रहा, मैं सिर्फ एज एन एग्जांपल देना चाह रहा हूँ कि ये कि जो रिलीजियस एक्सपीरियंसेस हैं, दिस इज लाइक द मोस्ट जो कि डैमेजिंग सी होती है. तो हाउ डू यू उसको जहन किस तरह से कबूल करता है? एक तो पैगंबर की तो एक बात है, लेकिन आम इंसानों की भी जो एक्सपीरियंसेस हैं और वो सुनते हैं, आप कहते हैं, तो उसको हाउ डू यू डिटरमिन कि दिस इज रियल वर्सेस अनरियल?
जैसे एक मैं कमेंट करना चाहूंगा اگر اجازت ہو تو اصل میں وہ جو لاس آف دا سینس آف دا سیکریڈ ہے نا، یہ اس کی وجہ سے بھی یہ اس طرح کی پرابلمز آ رہی ہیں. جو اولیاء کرام ہیں یا جو پیغمبر ہیں، جو بڑی بڑی اسپرچل ماسٹر، وہ دے میک دیئر پریزنس فیلٹ. یو کین فیل دی پریزنس آف دا سیکریڈ تھرو دیئر پرسنالٹیز. وہ اٹ سیلف اتنا کنونسنگ ایک ایویڈنس ہوتا ہے ان لوگوں کے لیے جو اولیاء کرام کی صحبت میں بیٹھتے رہے ہیں یا بیٹھتے ہیں، کہ وہ اتنا کنونسنگ ہوتا ہے کہ اس کے بعد کسی اور ایویڈنس کی ضرورت نہیں ہوتی. تو بیسیکلی وہ چونکہ اب جو ماڈرن مائنڈ ہے، وہ اس کو چونکہ ہی کی ناٹ فیل دی پریزنس آف دا سیکریڈ، وہ سینس ہی ختم ہو گئی ہے. تو ظاہری بات ہے پھر وہ جو ایک بڑا کنونسنگ ایویڈنس ہوتا تھا ٹریڈیشنل سوسائٹیز میں کہ the spiritual masters or the messengers they used to make their presence felt very strongly، کیونکہ ان کے تھرو بیسیکلی وہ مطلب انسان کامل کہہ لیں جو کہ خدا کی صفات کا مظہر ہوتا ہے نا. تو یہی اسی کو تو کہتے ہیں سینس آف دا سیکریڈ یا سینس آف دی ایبسولوٹ ان دی ریئلم آف چینج. تو وہ سینس ہی جو کہ ختم ہو گئی ہے، تو اس کی وجہ سے بھی یہ پرابلمز آ رہی ہیں ماڈرن ورلڈ میں. بس میں یہ کمنٹ کرنا چاہ رہا ہوں.
جی ڈاکٹر صاحب، اس میں ایک چیز یہ ہے کہ یہ آپ نے اس کو ٹائی کیا صحبت سے. تو اگر کسی کو صحبت میسر نہ ہو اور وہ اس سے بہت دور ہو، صرف کتابی باتیں ہوں اور آپ قریب بھی نہیں ہیں، اس ماحول میں بھی نہیں ہیں، تو پھر از دیر نو وے ٹو کنونس دیم؟ مطلب کہ پھر تو لاجک اور اس پہ بات آ گئی نا. آپ
ویسے
کیونکہ
تو یہ
ڈائریکٹ
ہے
ایکسپیرینس تو نہیں ہو رہا.
نہیں، ویسے تو یہ کہ اگر آپ کی بڑی سچی نیت ہے کہ آپ ایسے لوگوں کی صحبت میں بیٹھے ہیں، تو وہ قدرت خود ہی آپ کے لیے
نہیں
وہ جسے
میں
کہتے
کچھ
ہیں.
اور کہہ رہا ہوں. میں یہ کہہ رہا ہوں کہ اگر صحبت میسر نہ ہو، ایسا موقع ہی نہیں آیا، تو پھر تو اور آپ کنونس پھر وہ موقع پھر کیا ختم ہو جاتا ہے؟
نہیں، وہ یہ کیسے ہو سکتا ہے کہ قدرت آپ کے لیے ایسا انوائرمنٹ کریٹ نہ کرے؟
جی
اگر آپ کی نیت سچی ہے تو آپ یقیناً ایونچولی آپ کی ارد گرد ایسی انوائرمنٹ کریٹ ہو جائے گی کہ آپ کو اپنے آپ کو کنونس کرنے کا موقع ضرور ملے گا. آپ قدرت کو ساری ایکویشن سے باہر کیوں نکال رہے ہیں؟ ڈیوائن پلانس کو ساری ایکویشن سے باہر کیوں نکال رہے ہیں؟
صحیح.
یہ بھی تو بات ہے.
Yeah, I want to say something here. When you talked about experience and rationality, now we're kind of separating them. लेकिन अभी जो current modern, post-modern time चल रहा है, उसमें when you are doing research, so your research methods are very focused on human experiences. जैसे feminist perspectives हैं, black perspectives हैं, Latina perspectives हैं. So we are really Native American perspective. So all those experiences are kind of given value. And I think usko phir wo validate is tarah se karte hain ki they are multiple. Like you have these experiences, but you are kind of empirically trying to do it again and again and again and find out. And then finally you have a theory about it or something like that. So matlab abhi hai, and it's going on. Just say, in my own work, I studied several experiences of Chinese and how they think and understand international experiences of education, or phir unke world views kya hai. But then there is a whole lot of studies in studying the experiences of people, because aap ye nahi keh sakte ki har ek ka experience same hoga. Ek African students ka experience can be very different, or एक American faculty का experience can be very different than a brown or a woman faculty, मतलब even gendered, वो सारी चीजें भी हैं. So I think with this period, you can still marry these two things: reasoning and experience, or through empirical studies आप इसको कर सकते हैं, आप find out कर सकते हैं some of that information.
That's a good point. मतलब in the sense कि अगर intellectual intuition नहीं है, तो आप multiple experiences जो हैं उन पे आप बेस चीजें, it's another way of approaching it. जो it's in US में with diversity वो जो है, तो उसमें it's becoming more common that, for example, you can even do this more broadly, right? कि अगर आप you can look at how has different people or different cultures looked at a particular thing, right? So that itself will give you a broader perspective than a purely kind of something that comes out of the trajectory of the Western tradition. And maybe that itself will open up other modes of knowing and experiencing than you have in the, at least became normative in the West.
सब अगर इस जो अभी सारा कह रही है इसके भी अगर वो हम पेडिग्री देखें तो ये phenomenology में मेरे ख्याल जाती है, which again is quite problematic. Na? It's a reaction to rationalism and it bases itself more on the subjective experiences, but then from that subjectivity trying to come up with objective theories. तो इसको larger Western thought के उसमें ट्रैजेक्टरी में देखें तो कुछ और नतीजा निकलेगा, और अगर इस तरह देखें जैसे अभी हम देख रहे हैं तो हम इसको पॉजिटिवली ले सकते हैं, मगर अभी डॉक्टर साहब बेहतर इसको देखेंगे कि इसके अपने there's a streak of the irrational here which is anti intelligence कह रहे हैं कि it somehow very positive चीजें तो हैं वो तो, मगर इसका अगर थोड़ी पेडिग्री भी देखें तो फिर शायद मसला भी हो.
I think this
it's yeah, go ahead.
Social justice perspective. क्योंकि जैसे अभी नॉर्थ डकोटा है तो यहाँ पे if you look at the experiences of health experiences of different races, so white man lives average 78 years old. Long with the life expectancy, but a Native American man lives only 58 years old, right? So there's about 20, 30 years age life expectancy gap. So then you have to go back and find out the reasons. What is happening? What is an experience living in the same geographical location and in the same country? Why somebody is living 20 years or so longer than the person who's in the same region. So I think that these approaches are much more helpful. Same is true for Black man life in the United States. So they live much, shorter lives as compared to white men in that sense. So thinking from that perspective, it's more from, I think, social justice, more from this perspective of activism, help करती है चीजें understand करने, but it's not about sacred या उन चीजों को. Maybe you can bring some of it into the discussion कि कैसे world view क्या है लोगों के, but not really the larger cosmos in that sense. It's very still focused on man.
I mean, this is just talking about, it's some kind of a more practical, hikmat amali type चीज है ये, मतलब in the sense कि आप क्या conclusion draw कर सकते हो एक particular situation में. But it's tied, that was a great point कि जो तमूर साहब ने बयान किया कि इसमें भी एक this bit of, because you can't know things rationally, or it's a it is phenomenological, in a certain sense, a phenomenological perspective. That's generally in the social side, not generally, but which is a reaction. And while in some ways, I think the phenomenological perspective is an improvement in within from certain angles, but it still denies some kind of, I didn't know things. We have to kind of collect data, and although in certain things, of course, like the very specific you're giving, that might be useful to all. If that is our way of acquiring knowledge, is just through kind of collecting data from, even if from multiple sources, it has very little to do with knowledge in a traditional sense, or in knowledge of the sacred, or knowledge in a sense more than knowledge tied to our physical observation of things or kind of rationality. But I think Zarin Sabah, where does intuitive knowledge in rational terms stand? In rational terms. So I mean, I think intuitive knowledge, that's one of the problems with a perspective which is purely rationalistic. One could say there's no problem with rationality as such, right? Because rationality, though, it's a general part of kind of human consciousness, and it's a capacity that human beings have for rationality. I mean, Aristotle said, human beings are animals in the sense they share a certain species, but how are they different from the what is the specific difference? It's that they have rationality. How are they different? They have rationality. But if you reduce the human beings just to only that, then all he or she has is rationality. Right? So intuition, something that generally falls out as a respectable form of knowledge in the modern West, and more broadly with rationalistic or kind of scientific approaches. Although I would argue that we can't do anything without intuition. Even all scientific theories come from intuition, and sometimes that intuition might even be right or wrong, as in we can debate about theory of evolution or something, but it doesn't come from necessarily empirical observation. There's kind of a intuition in which things are kind of tied together in a theory. Like when the apple falls on Newton's head, he needs to totally understand what that means. It's not doing empirical observations only to get to that. So there is some intuition always involved, but generally intuition, particularly of higher truths, of some kind of world beyond our normal experience, gets lost. So that, for example, like going back to this hallucination versus spiritual experience thing, that people can't tell the difference between the two. Although there might be very clear ways of, maybe not as an outsider, but just standing far away. But there might be clear ways of determining, what is coming from inspiration or intuition, and what is just kind of and what is not. It's a hallucination or something like that. But I mean, but just going back to your main point, I think intuition becomes harder to uphold as a form of knowledge in a modern kind of perspective of modern philosophy. All right.
जबरदस्त क्लास रही है, टाइम का है, फिर इंशाल्लाह नेक्स्ट संडे का इंतजार रहेगा. And in any case, if anybody has any questions, they can post it on the WhatsApp group and we can forward it to you.
That's right. Yeah, so agar aap koi sawalaat ho, anything else you want to discuss, and then we can also, you can send it and we can pick it up next week as well. Next week is 2 small chapters. So we'll have them for you. I think the Musab will pass them on to you. But Martin Ling's book called Ancient Beliefs. Yeah.
जी ये मैं पूछने लगा था कि इसको हम कर रहे हैं, वो एंशिएंट बिलीफ्स पे हम मूव कर रहे हैं अगले हफ्ते. So we are done with this book or this chapter?
More or less, मेरा ख्याल है मोटे-मोटे पॉइंट्स तो हमने इसके ले लिए. अगर आपके और सवालात हैं इस किताब पे, तो वो आप या मुझसे आप उसके पूछ सकते हैं, या फिर नेक्स्ट टाइम आप वो इंट्रोड्यूस हम शुरू में बात कर सकते हैं और थोड़ी सी.
हाँ, वो 10 पेजेस पढ़ लेना, फिर कोई सवाल या वो कंफ्यूजन तो पूछ सकते.
जो इसके बाकी लेक्चर्स हैं, आपके ख्याल में उसकी अगर प्रायोरिटी आप सेट करना चाहें, क्योंकि सारी किताब तो बड़ी ज़ख़ीम है, वो नहीं पढ़ी जा सकती इस छोटे से अरसे में. तो अगर आप उसको प्रायोरिटाइज करना चाहें, तो हमने व्हाट इज ट्रेडिशन तो हमने मेरे ख्याल में इन द पास्ट भी शेयर हुआ है. उसके अलावा आप क्या सजेस्ट करते हैं उनमें से?
अच्छा, इसमें जो बात मुझे तो इस किताब के, बल्कि ये 2-3 शुरू के जो चैप्टर्स हैं, ये तो एक जरा सा बेसिकली ये तो एक प्रीफेस है मेरे ख्याल में. ये थोड़ा इसमें हिस्टोरिकली डॉक्टर सर देख रहे हैं कि कैसे नॉलेज डिसेंट्रलाइज हुई, फिर ट्रेडिशन क्या है, ट्रेडिशन को कैसे दोबारा, ये दैट्स द फर्स्ट 3 चैप्टर्स. बाकी सारे जो चैप्टर्स आर रियली द हार्ट और सीरियस मैटर ऑफ द बुक. मतलब इन द सेंस कि वो डिफरेंट टॉपिक्स पे हैं, जो कि जिसमें उन्होंने एक critique بھی دی ہے modern perspectives کی, اور ایک انہوں نے بہت ایک ٹریڈیشنل پرسپیکٹو فرام ڈفرینٹ ٹریڈیشنس میں اسلامک بھی ہے اور جو کرسچن پلیٹونک ونس اینڈ چائنیز ہندو وغیرہ ان سے بھی انہوں نے لی ہوئی ہیں چیزیں. اس میں انہوں نے دکھایا ہے کہ کاسموس جیسے نیچر ایک چیپٹر 6 کاسموس از تھیوفنی کہ جو نیچر ہے اور کاسموس جو ہے وہ تجلی کیسے ہے. تو وہ ایک مطلب وہ تو اس میں یہ ہے کہ جو جس چیز میں آپ کو ٹاپک اگر آپ کو نیچر کاسموس میں انٹرسٹ ہے تو چیپٹر 6 ہوگا. چیپٹر 5 ہے مین پونٹیفیشل اینڈ پرومیتھین, وہ بہت اچھا چیپٹر ہے. انسان کیا ہے, پونٹیفیشل ہوا کہ جو ایک پونٹکس ہے مطلب برج ہے, برزخ ہے انسان, ایک روحانی اور مطلب ایک مٹیریل اور اسپرچل کے درمیان, رائٹ. سو اس دنیا میں خلیفۃ اللہ جیسے ہے. اور پرومیتھین ہے جو پرومیتھیس ایک ماڈرن مین کے انہوں نے استعمال کیا ہے, وہ پرومیتھیس کی میتھ ہے. اینی ویز اس میں جو ایک خدا سے کچھ چوری کر کے خود اپنے لیے استعمال کرنے کی کوشش کرتا آگ, تو وہ ایک ویری ڈفرنٹ انڈرسٹینڈنگ آف مین. تو اس میں انہوں نے وہ ڈسکس کیا ہے. نمبر 7 چیپٹر 7 پہ ٹائم کے بارے میں ہے, چیپٹر 8 آرٹ کے بارے میں ہے, چیپٹر 9 جو ہے وہ ڈائیورسٹی آف ریلیجس فارمس کے بارے میں, پلورل ڈفرنٹ ریلیجنز, یہ وہ. چیپٹر 10 سیکرڈ مطلب روحانیت اسپرچوالٹی کے بارے میں ہے, اور ایک اور بھی ہے چیپٹر 4 ہاں سائنس کیا ہوتی ہے. تو مطلب یہ سارے میرے خیال میں انٹرسٹنگ چیپٹرز ہیں, میں کوئی زیادہ پرائورٹی نہیں دی جا سکتی, ڈیپینڈز آن کون سا آپ کو تھیم کون سی پسند ہے, تو اس میں سے آپ وہ اٹھا سکتے.
جی سارے بہت مزیدار ہیں. ٹھیک ہے انشاءاللہ وقت کا مقابلہ سب کچھ کرتے ہیں.
چیپٹر 4 سے بھی میرے خیال میں تو کتاب شروع ہوتی ہے چیپٹر 4 سے, مطلب ویری انٹرسٹنگ باقی بھی, مگر اٹس جسٹ کائنڈ آف دا مین میٹر آف دا بک.
انشاءاللہ.
ایکسلنٹ جی, تھینک یو ویری مچ.
تیمور صاحب ایک چھوٹی سی بات پارٹیسپینٹس کے لیے میں کرنا چاہ رہا تھا کہ ڈاکٹر فہد وہ جو بات کر رہے تھے کہ ایسی نالج جس میں نالج اینڈ بینگ سیپریٹ ہوتے ہیں, تو ہم نے اصل میں کچھ عرصہ پہلے فاضل صاحب نے فلسافیکل ڈسکشن کی تھی علم حصولی اور علم حضوری پہ. تو وہ اگر آپ وہ تو اس سے اگر پارٹیسپینٹس ریلیٹ کر سکیں کہ جہاں نالج اور بینگ اکٹھے ہو جاتے ہیں وہ علم حضوری ہے, اور جہاں وہ سیپریٹ ہوتے ہیں وہ علم حصولی ہے بیسیکلی. تو بس میں چاہ رہا تھا کہ پارٹیسپینٹس اس ڈسکشن کو اس کے ساتھ ریلیٹ کر لیں. تھینک یو.
جی ہاں بہت تھینک یو. میں نے وہ بات میں کرنا چاہ رہا تھا علم الحضوری پہ, میں نے کہا پھر پتہ نہیں کہ پڑھی ہے کہ نہیں, وہ پورا ایکسپلینیشن دینی اس کو, ایک نئی ٹرمینالوجی. تو یہ بہت اچھا ہے اگر انہوں نے آپ لوگوں نے یہ پڑھی ہوئی ہے, تو یہ علم الحضوری کی بات ہو رہی ہے. بالکل جی
جی جی بالکل.
ٹھیک ہے جی, بہت بہت شکریہ. اٹ واز ونڈرفل ماشاءاللہ. تھینک یو.
تھینک یو. اٹس نائس ٹو بی ہیئر. انشاءاللہ عید مبارک سب کو. پہلے سے ملاقات
عید مبارک.
غیر داغ دل نمی باشد در این غربت سرا خورشید تنها گرد را ماند. در این غربت سرا خورشید تنها گرد را ماند.